The scent of beeswax polish clung to the silverware as tightly as secrets clung to the walls of Highley Hall. Every candle flickered like a whisper. And yet, amidst the lacquered opulence of the banquet chamber, she moved without sound, her steps as measured as breath, her gaze always lowered. No one looked at her, no one ever did. Her name was Clara Whitlow. 17 when she arrived, now 23, she had become as invisible to the house's noble residents as the draughts that curled under the doors. She was a maid of low speech and quiet spine, at least that's what the gentry believed. They would not have known her voice if she'd spoken directly into their ears. Clara had been in the Duke's service for 6 years. The Duke of Anselmere, Nathaniel Greystone, tall, frigid, and famed for his indifference, had never once spoken her name aloud. He gave commands like one gives to furniture. Wine, fire, napkin. Never Clara. Not even once. But she remembered the sound of his voice. Each syllable he uttered seemed weighed in gold before release. His presence drained rooms of air. Women flushed, men straightened. And yet he was more haunted than haughty, more statue than sovereign. She had watched him from behind door frames, from stair landings, from the far edge of the ballroom, watched him the way the moon watches the tide. He never looked back. Tonight, the dining chamber was transformed for the royal banquet in honor of Prince Alfred's visit. Candles in crystal sconces cast golden prisms across marble, and embroidered banners hung above the heads of titled guests. There were over 100 noble names represented at that table. Every duchess wore her fortune on her neck, every gentleman had polished his boots twice, and Clara moved among them like a ghost between chandeliers. The servants were not to be spoken to unless they dropped something, and Clara never dropped anything. She had placed the third silver spoon to the left of the Viscountess's plate when Lady Edwina Claremont, draped in velvet and smirking, whispered just loud enough for her companions to hear, "It always surprises me how they train the help so well these days, like little mutes with lace cuffs." Clara did not flinch, she never did, but her pulse sang in her ears and her hands grew colder. The hall began to quiet as footmen lit the final candles and doors were opened with heraldic flourish. The guests stood. A name was announced. His Grace Nathaniel Greystone, Duke of Anselmere. He entered alone, as he always did. The Crown Prince would follow shortly, but the Duke's arrival was its own event. His eyes were like winter light, beautiful and bitter, touching nothing for long. Clara stepped back into shadow, as all maids did when the nobility passed. He should have walked by her. He always did. But tonight something shifted. Just as he reached the table's head, he paused. Not dramatically, barely perceptibly. Then, without turning his head, without scanning the room for approval, he spoke the one word no one had ever heard from his mouth. Clara. It was quiet, but it stopped the entire hall. She froze, fingers curled around the stem of a wineglass, and slowly lifted her eyes. He was already looking at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. The Duchess of Halmore coughed into her handkerchief. Lady Edwina's fork clattered to her plate. Somewhere near the lower table, a servant nearly dropped a tray. Clara did not speak, but something inside her had already broken open. She stepped back into the darkness, and the Duke took his seat. The musicians resumed their playing, a hesitant waltz stitched together with bows and nerves. Conversation crept back like fog after a storm, shallow and uncertain. Yet every guest at the royal banquet felt it. The moment had changed something. Something had cracked, not loudly but irrevocably. Clara stood in the shadows just beyond the colonnade, her back pressed against the cool marble, her heart galloping. The other maids cast furtive glances her way, each more curious than the last, but none dared speak to her. In the rigid world of Highley Hall, a name spoken by the Duke might as well be a shot fired in a chapel. At the head of the table, the Duke was silent as ever, his eyes never returning to Clara. His knife slid effortlessly through veal, and he lifted his goblet with the same precision he applied to all things. It was as though nothing had occurred. But Clara knew better. She felt it in her blood. That single syllable, her name her own, had struck harder than any orchestral swell or thunderclap. Lady Edwina, ever eager to fill silence with poison, leaned across the white linen tablecloth toward the Duchess of Halmore and whispered, "He must have mistaken her for someone else. Surely, perhaps he meant Clarissa Farnley." "Clarissa Farnley is in Bath," murmured the Duchess, arching a brow, "and far too fond of orange ribbon to be mistaken for a scullery maid." There was a brittle laughter among the ladies, the kind that only ever surfaces when uncertainty grips the spine. The Duke's actions had introduced something unclean into the air, unpredictability. A steward beckoned Clara to the wine station with a discreet motion. She obeyed, glass in hand, her legs steady by sheer practice. She began refilling decanters, working behind the carved oak counter, barely breathing. At that very moment, the royal herald announced the prince's arrival. The Crown Prince, Alfred of Ravensworth, entered to polite applause, flanked by guards in crimson sashes. His smile was quicksilver, warm and hollow, but his eyes were sharp. They scanned the room not for affection, but advantage. He took his place beside the Duke and offered a low comment that made Nathaniel's mouth twitch, if such a motion could be called a smile. Clara saw none of it. She kept her eyes down, though her mind churned with heat and speculation. Throughout the meal, courses came and went: partridge with plum glaze, leek soup with wild thyme, pears poached in claret. But it was not the food that held the court's attention. It was the question that rippled through the silence between bites. Why had the Duke said her name? There were those who believed the Duke incapable of familiarity. His own cousin, Lord Bramley, once claimed that Nathaniel had not uttered a woman's name in private conversation for over 3 years, not even his late mother's. If he referred to someone, it was always by rank or relation. The Dowager, my aunt, Lady Northcote, never Isabella, never Margaret, and certainly never Clara. Now the staff was unsettled. One of the older footmen, Hollis, whispered in the hallway as they traded trays. "Mark me, she's caught his eye somehow. But don't think it's a good thing, Clara. When these men look at us, it's only ever to use or discard." Clara didn't answer. She simply nodded and returned to the dining hall, carrying a silver jug of warmed wine. As she moved past the Countess of Serevin, she heard it again, a voice meant for others, meant to sting. "I suppose she's taken to pouring herself into the Duke's good graces, drop by drop," the Countess drawled. And then a ripple of laughter from nearby baronesses, not cruel in tone but worse, mocking in the way only women of power could be when someone beneath them dared draw notice. Clara placed the jug carefully on the table and withdrew. She moved with the poise of someone used to vanishing, but beneath her skin something unfamiliar stirred, not pride, not shame, something raw and rising. She did not ask for his attention, but he had spoken her name, and nothing, not silence, not laughter, not scorn, could unsay it now. Clara's first winter at Highley Hall had been one of brutal winds and colder silences. The manor stood on the edge of moorland, its chimneys like black spires against a slate sky. She had arrived in a frost-bitten cart with 2 trunkless companions, girls younger than herself, trembling beneath borrowed shawls. She was 17, freshly orphaned, and marked by the kind of loss that leaves the voice dry and the eyes too old. She was taken in not out of charity but necessity. Lady Haversley, then mistress of the house and the Duke's aunt, required additional maids after the last footman absconded with her ladyship's ruby combs. Clara was quiet, obedient, and unthreatening, and so was placed in the lowest rank of indoor service. She slept in the garret with the chimney brushes and rose before any bell had rung. It was not until her 3rd month that she first laid eyes on the Duke. She had been scrubbing the entry stones after a storm when he returned from London. His boots were mud-caked, his carriage gleamed with rain, and his eyes passed over her like wind over snow. She hadn't expected acknowledgement, but she never forgot the weight of that glance, brief as it was, cold, measured, as though she were not a person, but an architectural flaw in the corridor. Still, she watched him from a distance, always from a distance. In truth, she knew more about the Duke of Anselmere than any servant ought. She had overheard the estate manager grumble about Nathaniel's refusal to remarry after his betrothed, Lady Meredith, died tragically of fever 2 winters prior. Some said he had loved her beyond reason. Others said the match had been forced by family ambition and her death was more convenience than sorrow. But Clara had seen the man in the chapel that spring, seated alone beneath the stained glass window, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were bloodless. He did not cry. Nathaniel Greystone did not believe in visible grief. Clara, however, did. She mourned daily for things others could not see: the mother who died after months of coughing, the father lost at sea. She mourned the sound of her own laughter, long vanished from her throat. And she mourned, quietly and without admitting it, for the space she occupied in the world, so small it might as well have been dust. Once, during a snowstorm that rendered the estate unreachable for 4 days, she had been asked to bring warm brandy to the library. He was alone by the hearth, dressed not in court clothes but in worn riding trousers and an open collar. He did not speak, nor did he turn his head when she entered. As she bent to place the glass on the side table, a book slid from the arm of the chair. Without thinking, Clara caught it mid-air and set it down gently beside the decanter. Her sleeve brushed his fingers. He flinched. Their eyes met for a breath. His were bloodshot, sleepless. "Leave it," he said softly, not unkindly, not commandingly, just weary. She left the room before her heart could betray her. After that, nothing changed. He remained distant, his voice never forming her name. She remained dutiful, her soul retreating into quieter places. But privately, Clara began to read. Each night, long after the others had collapsed onto straw mattresses, she stole into the old steward's study, a room no longer in use, and lit a stub of candle. She read from books she could barely pronounce, histories and sonnets and medical journals. She learned how to bandage a broken wrist, how to spot forged ink, how to speak French haltingly but persistently. She wrote letters she never sent, to her parents, to the Duke, to herself. She stitched her wounds in silence, and always, always she remained unseen. Until last night, until the banquet, until the impossible syllables of her name emerged from his mouth, as if pulled from the shadows she had inhabited all her life. She did not understand why. Not yet. But she remembered that evening long ago, when her sleeve had touched his skin and he had flinched, not from her touch, she now believed, but from something else, from being seen. Now, perhaps, he had finally looked again. And Clara Whitlow was no longer content to remain invisible. 3 weeks before the royal banquet, Clara had written a letter by candlelight in the abandoned steward's study. The hour had been indecent, well past midnight, and the parchment had trembled beneath her fingers. She signed no name, only an initial. The letter was not for a lover nor a relative. It was addressed to Mr. Alton Pierce, solicitor of Greywick and Sons, a discreet legal firm known to the late Lady Haversley. The contents of the letter were simple but sharp. It requested confirmation of a transaction made 10 years prior, one witnessed in secret, never recorded in the public ledgers of the estate. Clara had found evidence of it in a ledger discarded in the back of the west attic, buried beneath moth-eaten curtains and forgotten tea crates. The sum had been large. The recipient's name, partially obscured by mold, had become legible only after she gently steamed the page open. Meredith S. Halcombe, later Lady Meredith Greystone, the betrothed of the Duke. Clara knew it was madness to meddle with the affairs of the nobility, but she had also learned that the truth, when left untouched, had a tendency to rot like meat behind locked doors. So she wrote the letter. She folded it thrice. She gave it to a footman traveling to the village under the pretense of sending a fabric order. 2 weeks passed. The reply came sealed in grey wax. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she hid it beneath the floorboard of her garret room, beneath the wooden plank that creaked on every third step. She lay awake each night, staring at the ceiling beam, rehearsing possibilities in her head, a forgery, a fraud, a family lie buried beneath decades of propriety. She had no intention of exposing anyone. She only wanted to understand why silence hung so heavily over Meredith's name. It was only when the invitations for the royal banquet were sent that Clara made her choice. She opened the letter. The contents were brief and devastatingly precise. Yes, the transaction occurred. Yes, it had been witnessed by a man still alive, Mr. Pierce himself. And yes, the money had been paid to prevent the exposure of a relationship that, if revealed, would have scandalized both families. Clara folded the letter again, very slowly, and breathed out into the night. 3 days later, she returned to the steward's study, not for a book but for a drawer that no one else knew remained unlocked. Within it, wrapped in yellowed silk, lay the miniature portrait of a woman, young, dark-haired, unsmiling. The painting was unsigned, but Clara recognized the brushwork. It matched one displayed in the gallery under the name Mio Halcombe. Lady Meredith. On the back of the miniature was a note in faded ink. For you alone, Clara stood with the object in her hand for several minutes. Her breath came shallow. Her heart ached in ways she could not explain. She did not weep. Instead, she hid the letter and the miniature within a hollow of her apron and walked them down to the small stone chapel behind the estate. There, in the dusty pew beneath the greystone coat of arms, she knelt and said nothing. She simply listened. The following morning, she handed both items, not to a maid nor a steward, but to Mr. Gregory Hollowell, the Duke's valet. An older man, loyal and impassive, Gregory had once told Clara she was the only one among the staff who irons sleeves properly. "I do not ask you to interfere," she said softly, "only to see that His Grace receives these in private, and to say, he need not speak to me, ever." Gregory had studied her for a long moment before replying. "He already has, Miss Whitlow," he murmured, whether he meant to or not. Now, standing in the corridor outside the dining hall, Clara felt the moment approaching, not like a storm, like the slow shift of ground beneath old stone. One did not know it was happening until the hearth cracked or the glass trembled. She saw the Duke raise a hand. A footman moved. A signal. The toast was about to begin. And somewhere outside, waiting in a hired carriage, was Mr. Alton Pierce, summoned not by the Duke but by a servant girl no one saw. Except him. Except now. The final course had been cleared. Candied oranges with cinnamon peel, served on plates of blue porcelain rimmed in gold. Wine glasses stood half empty, jewels glinted under the chandelier's last blaze, and the air was dense with aristocratic satisfaction. Prince Alfred reclined in his chair like a cat among hounds, twirling his signet ring with bored amusement. It was the Duke who rose. He did so without announcement, yet the room fell still. He was not a man given to speeches. He was not a man given to anything, truth be told, save silence and snowbound brooding. So when Nathaniel Greystone stood and took his glass in hand, all eyes turned. Conversations froze in mid-laugh. Even the musicians halted their final notes mid-bow. "Your Royal Highness," he began, nodding briefly to the prince, "my lords and ladies, thank you for honoring this table tonight." A few approving murmurs rippled. "But before we lift our glasses," the Duke continued, voice quiet but crisp, "there is one name I must speak, and one truth I must admit to this house." Clara, standing behind the second tier of servants, felt the blood leave her fingertips. "I have long neglected to give proper recognition to a person who has, in her quiet constancy, preserved more of this estate's integrity than any title ever could." He paused. Not for effect, he was not a dramatist, but because the next words weighed heavily. Miss Clara Whitlow. A collective intake of breath. Then silence. Startled, feral silence. Lady Edwina's expression cracked as though someone had struck her with a fan. From the far end of the table, someone dropped a fork. The sound was small but obscene, like glass shattering in a chapel. The Duke's gaze did not waver. He was not looking at the guests. He was looking at Clara. "I have known her name," he said plainly, For 6 years. I failed to speak it not from ignorance, but from shame. Not hers. Mine. Gasps now. Audible. She once returned to me a book I had not the heart to read. She once delivered warmth when I could not bear to feel. And more recently she reminded me, quietly, devastatingly, of a truth I had buried alongside someone we both lost. Now the prince straightened. Lady Meredith Halcombe was not merely my intended. She was, briefly and without my knowledge, the guardian of a child, one not born of her body but entrusted to her by blood and circumstance. That child is Miss Whitlow. The room erupted, not in shouts, yet, but in whispers, sharp and urgent, like knives being drawn beneath tablecloths. She was taken in under silence, protected by secrecy and forgotten by convenience, the Duke said, his voice rising now but still firm. But no longer. I have submitted documentation to legitimize her name and her share of the Halcombe Trust. Impossible, snapped Lord Bramley, half standing. That money was divided years ago. The Halcombe line ended with Meredith's death. Not quite, came a new voice. Mr. Alton Pierce had stepped through the side door, hat in hand, coat damp from the mist. He did not bow. He walked directly to the table and placed a packet of papers before the Duke. These are the original records, the solicitor said calmly, with Lady Meredith's handwritten affidavit and my own as witness. Pandemonium began in earnest now, chairs scraping, titles shouted, dowagers half fainting into embroidered sleeves. Chairs scraping, titles shouted, dowagers half fainting into embroidered sleeves. The Duchess of Halmore stood like she might call for guards, until the Crown Prince himself raised a hand. "Let the Duke finish," Alfred said, amusement twitching in his tone. Nathaniel nodded once stiffly and turned to Clara. "You did not ask for any of this," he said, words rough now, splintering beneath emotion. "You never asked for anything." Clara could barely breathe. "You have more honor in your silence than we have shown in our ceremony," he finished. And then, for the first time, he raised his glass, not to royalty, not to tradition, but to her. To Miss Clara Whitlow. There was no echo, no polite repetition. Only one glass joined his, Alfred's. The rest remained frozen, paralyzed by scandal. Clara stood behind the velvet rope, unable to move. She had not spoken. She had not stepped forward. But every eye was on her. The girl no one saw. Now at the center of the storm. The room seethed in stunned inertia, every breath drawn tight as a corset string. It was the Duchess of Halmore who moved first, rising slowly, every movement precise, like a knife being lifted from silk. "This is unseemly," she hissed, voice low but cutting. "An act of madness, and at a royal banquet no less. To claim a servant is... what, some lost cousin? A bastard of convenience?" Nathaniel did not flinch. "She is Lady Meredith Halcombe's ward," he said with quiet force. "A role her late ladyship documented herself and entrusted to me before her death. I failed that trust." "But why now?" snapped Lord Bramley, red-faced and incredulous. "Why parade this deception before peers and royalty?" "Because she is not a deception," the Duke replied evenly. "She is the final truth Lady Meredith ever gave me." From the second tier of servants, Clara watched the battle unfold, her back ramrod straight. Her cheeks burned, not from shame but exposure. She had done nothing but live quietly, work diligently, and discover what was hers to know. And now the grand machinery of title and inheritance rattled dangerously above her head, uncertain whether to grind her under or acknowledge her existence. A baroness whispered behind a hand-painted fan, "The Halcombe Trust was merged into the Greystone estate upon Meredith's death. If this girl is recognized, it could fracture the holdings." "Precisely," murmured the Marquis of Elston. "The Duke invites scandal." "I invite justice," Nathaniel said, his voice suddenly sharper, "and I remind this table that the late Lady Meredith was known not only for beauty and breeding, but for principle." "She was also known for discretion," Lady Edwina countered, standing now, chin trembling from fury. She would never have wanted this farce played out in public. Surely that letter is forged. The solicitor stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "I saw her sign it," said Mr. Pierce. "I held her hand afterward. She was dying. She spoke clearly, and she called Clara by name." The legal tone of his voice lent weight none could dismiss. "And the funds?" someone called from farther down the table. "The Halcombe inheritance cannot simply be divided at whim." Nathaniel turned to his steward, who stepped forward with a small leather ledger. "The portion Meredith designated for her ward was never disbursed," the Duke said, tapping the book. "It remained untouched in a holding account under my seal. I kept it hidden, and I will answer for that failure, but it is hers." The guests were unraveling now, like a corset thread pulled too tight. Half the room fumed in disbelief, the other half leaned in, drawn by the scent of scandal blooming in real time. And yet through it all, Clara said nothing. Her silence was not weakness. It was the armor she had forged over years of listening, watching, knowing her place. She still wore her maid's dress, still stood at the servants' line, but even the prince was looking at her now. "She carries herself better than half the ladies here," he muttered with a smirk to no one in particular. Lady Edwina turned to the prince, desperate now. "Your Highness, surely you cannot condone this." The prince leaned back in his chair, appraising Clara like one might study a puzzle nearly solved. "I condone nothing," he said lightly, "but I do admire spectacle. And if this young woman truly holds a legal claim, and the good Duke is willing to part with a sum most of you would misplace at the opera, then I see no reason to interfere." His grin widened. "In fact, I'm rather enjoying this." Lady Edwina nearly choked. At that moment, Gregory Hollowell, the Duke's valet, stepped forward with silent dignity and placed a small velvet box before Clara. Not into her hands, she had not moved, but beside her, as if offering rather than bestowing. She knew what was inside. The signet ring of Lady Meredith, worn on her pinky finger in private life, removed only in death. Nathaniel had retrieved it from the chapel 2 weeks ago and left it to Gregory with one instruction: wait until the moment feels earned. Now the household watched. From footmen to kitchen girls, every servant stunned to stillness. Slowly, Clara stepped forward. One step only. She lifted the lid. Inside, the delicate band caught the candlelight. Not once did she look toward the nobles still arguing across the banquet table. She looked only to the Duke. She did not speak, but in her stillness, in her gaze, there was the sharpness of something recovered. And though the room tried to bite her down with fury and fear, Clara Whitlow did not bow. The sound of weeping did not come from Clara. It came from the edge of the banquet table. Lady Halcombe's distant cousin, Margaret Fernley, who had spent the past 10 years assuming herself heir to Meredith's memory. Her lace cuff trembled as she lifted a kerchief to her cheek, not out of sorrow but rage disguised as grief. "She was never meant to have it," Margaret gasped, voice high and unsteady. "She was no more than a house wretch. And now she claims what, a legacy, a family? It is a manipulation, nothing more." The Duchess of Halmore placed a hand on Margaret's arm, a gesture both calming and performative. "Compose yourself, Margaret. There are royal eyes upon you." But it was too late. The mask had slipped, and Margaret's trembling turned into a full collapse, her sobs echoing over the stunned silence. A servant moved to help her, but she slapped his hand away, cheeks flushed with humiliation. Clara remained still. Clara remained still. Her palms were slick with cold sweat, hidden behind the folds of her skirt. The signet ring remained in its box. She had not touched it, and yet the weight of it anchored the room. Nathaniel had not sat down. He stood with one hand braced on the table, his mouth set, his face unreadable. He had not expected Clara to step forward. She could see that now. He had hoped, but not dared to presume. Across the hall, Prince Alfred leaned toward his steward and murmured something that made the younger man nod and vanish into a side chamber. The prince's gaze then settled on Clara, speculative and oddly softened. "Your Grace," he said to Nathaniel, his tone less amused now. "What do you intend, should the lady accept your declaration?" Nathaniel looked not at the prince, but at Clara. "If she wishes to remain in service," he said slowly, "I will not remove her. But she will do so with her rightful name, her full inheritance, and my public acknowledgement." "And if she does not wish to remain?" asked the prince, his voice a blade hidden in silk. "Then she will have freedom, a London home, a portion of the Halcombe Trust in her own name, and no obligation to this house again." The court gasped. That kind of generosity from a duke was not a gesture, it was a revolution. Lady Edwina stepped forward now, her lips twisted. "You disgrace the name of every woman here. You bring a bastard child to the banquet of the crown and expect us to pretend she belongs?" Clara finally spoke. Not loud but sharp, like a single note drawn clean on a violin. "I was not brought here." The room turned. "I have been here," she continued, her voice steady. "I have served your tables, scrubbed your floors, fetched your wine. I buried my parents with no stone to mark them, while you drank claret beneath chandeliers." Lady Edwina paled. "I have watched you speak over others like me, dismiss us, laugh in our silence. You never wondered who we were beyond the apron." She looked to the Duke, but he did. Silence, deep and resonant. And then from the side, a sound neither cruel nor formal, a sob, this time small and honest. It came from one of the younger maids, Eliza, no more than 16, who had followed Clara for months like a younger sister watches an older one rise. She wiped her cheek and whispered, "They'll never be able to unsee you now." Clara's throat closed, not with fear, not even with relief, but with something larger, like the first breath taken after years under water. Gregory stepped forward again, slower now and with a bow deeper than any he had ever given. "Miss Whitlow," he said, formal and reverent, "the chapel has been prepared. Should you wish to place the ring yourself, Lady Meredith's memory would be honored." Clara looked down at the box. Then gently she lifted the ring. The metal was warm already. She did not speak again. She simply turned and began to walk, not toward the servants' wing, not toward the garret staircase, but down the center of the banquet hall. The path opened before her, not from courtesy but awe. And somewhere behind her, as if the sound were centuries old, the Duke exhaled. The hall had never known such silence. Not even during morning feasts for dukes or the crown's own emissaries had it stood so still. As Clara walked the length of the room, past tapestries that had never known her name, past peers who had never once looked into her eyes, the atmosphere held its breath. She was not escorted. She did not wait for permission. She passed under the chandelier's fractured light, her shoes soundless on marble, her back straight not from pride, but from having nothing left to lose. Nathaniel did not follow. He stood rooted, his eyes on her like a promise made not in passion but in reparation. The great doors opened for her without signal. Outside, the air struck her with a coolness scented by lavender and storm. The chapel lay a short walk across the inner court, its bell tower dark and ivy-clad, standing like a memory carved from stone. A single lantern burned near the chapel door. She walked to it as if drawn by something ancient. The box cradling Lady Meredith's ring was still in her hands, and with each step the weight of it shifted, not heavier, but more real. Inside the chapel, Gregory waited, not as a valet, but as an old man serving a final duty. No one else was present, no titles, no gloved hands, just Clara, the candlelight, and the place where Meredith Halcombe's name had been etched into wood above the altar. Gregory gestured silently toward the small stone pedestal. Clara stepped forward. The miniature portrait lay there already, the one she had found and returned. Its eyes met hers in that final painted stillness, young, solemn, beautiful. Meredith had been just 25 when she died, barely a decade older than Clara was now. With no ceremony, Clara placed the signet ring beside the portrait, and for a moment the room was filled with a silence so pure it hummed. Gregory bowed deeply. "She would be proud," he said. She trusted the wrong man at first, but she chose well in the end. She chose to trust you." Clara nodded once, and something in her throat trembled. Outside, a carriage waited, not one marked for the servants, but a Greystone coach, its trim polished, its lanterns glowing warm. Nathaniel stood beside it, coat unfastened, his posture unsure for the first time since she had known him. "I made a mistake," he said when she approached, "not just in hiding your name, but in underestimating how much you already knew." She looked at him then, not as a maid, nor an heir, but as a woman who had seen him through silences deeper than history. "You didn't speak my name," she said quietly, "until you were afraid of forgetting it." He did not argue. "I will leave tonight," she continued, "not from shame, but to decide for myself where I belong." "And if I asked you to stay?" he asked, voice uneven. "I would ask you why." He closed his eyes briefly. "Because I don't want to forget again." She studied him, this man who had commanded rooms with a glance, who had buried his grief beneath lineage and law, and now stood beside a carriage, not as a duke, but as a man asking not to be alone. "I may return," she said, "but not as a secret, not as a whisper. Never again. Then we shall see." She turned from him and stepped into the carriage. The driver touched his hat. The door closed. The wheels moved slowly at first, then with purpose, turning down the long drive that led away from Highley Hall. Behind her, the banquet dissolved into murmurs, the estate into shadow. But before the gates closed, she looked back once, just once. Nathaniel remained where she left him, not in defeat, but in waiting. For the first time, he waited for her. In the days that followed, Highley Hall grew quieter, not in its duties, but in its tone, the kind of hush that follows a lightning strike, when even the birds hesitate to sing again. The banquet was never spoken of directly, not in letters, not in parlors, not even in whispers over tea. Yet its echo traveled further than any carriage. Invitations to Lady Edwina's next ball were quietly declined by half the county. The Duchess of Halmore withdrew to her London townhouse for her nerves. Lord Bramley petitioned for clarification on the Halcombe Trust. His request was answered with one sentence from the Duke's office. "The trust has been settled. Permanently." Servants spoke of it more freely, though not without awe. "She walked out like a queen," said Hollis the footman. "Not a tear, not a tremble," marveled Eliza. "She was light as breath, but not afraid." "She touched nothing but the truth," Gregory Hollowell said, polishing a silver candlestick, "and that's what unsettled them." The Greystone estate, once governed by tradition and silence, now held a shadow that did not move. Her absence was felt in all the small places. The unmended sleeve no one noticed, the ledger page left unturned, the night when the Duke dined alone in the library and did not ring for wine. No one mentioned her name, and yet it lingered. In every corridor, on every polished stair, it waited. Nathaniel Greystone kept to himself. His presence at court diminished. He declined a hunting invitation from the Earl of Wendley and refused to attend Prince Alfred's spring fete. He walked often through the old chapel, alone, pausing sometimes before the pedestal where Meredith's miniature and signet ring now rested together in peace. Once, in the gallery, he stood before a portrait of his ancestors, unreadable. "She sees us now," he murmured, though no one was there to hear. Letters arrived for him in her hand, always addressed to the Duke of Anselmere, always brief. Updates on her readings, her efforts to establish a small home in Bath, her intention to take no funds she did not earn herself. She had claimed only what was lawfully hers from the Halcombe Trust and refused any Greystone pension. "I have no interest in being a kept woman," she had written, but she had not signed it Clara Whitlow. The first letter bore only a single word beneath her closing: Meredith. It was not a claim to station. It was a bond, worn, bloodless, but unbroken. The staff noticed subtle changes. Gregory kept her chamber as it was. The old steward's study remained locked. The Duke left instructions that no maid was ever again to be dismissed without a written review, and that every servant's name be recorded in the estate register, not by roll, but full Christian name. "No one here is invisible," he had said. Society moved on, of course. It always does. But Highley Hall remembered. When new guests arrived, their gazes often lingered too long on the corridor leading to the east wing, or on the small chapel behind the hedgerow. The story was never recounted, but the air held it, like the way a room remembers fire even after the last ash cools. Servants sometimes whispered her name in the stillness before dawn, as if summoning courage. Clara. But aloud, it was never said again by the lords and ladies who once ignored her. She had become in absence too powerful to speak of, and yet in every polished surface, every silent corner she remained. Not a ghost, not a scandal. Something far rarer. A woman they could not forget. The housekeeper who replaced the late Lady Haversley kept meticulous records. She reorganized the linen cupboards, replaced the broken latch on the pantry door, and insisted that every servant's anniversary of service be marked with a half-day's rest. She worked quietly and without favor. But in the back of her journal, under a flap of pressed parchment, she kept a single page that had not been officially entered. It read, "Clara Whitlow, chambermaid, 6 years, Meredith Halcombe's ward, departed the household with dignity, remembered in silence." Clara had not returned to Highley Hall, though her letters came, sometimes with wildflower seeds tucked inside, sometimes with a clipped verse from a book she was reading in the Bath libraries. She lived modestly, by choice not necessity, and made a name among tutors and private readers as a woman of rare intellect and rarer restraint. She was invited to speak at a women's society in Bath. She declined. She was offered the stewardship of an orphanage founded by the Marchioness of Beresford. She declined that too. What she did, few knew. But her name passed quietly between those who understood how dangerous dignity could be. Nathaniel Greystone never married. He took no mistresses, attended no parties. His estate flourished under new policies, and his tenants received repairs and leniency that had once been unheard of. He built a reading hall on the estate's edge, and when pressed for a name, offered none. But the servants knew. They called it Whitlow House. On its walls hung no portraits, only one poem framed in wood. Clara herself had sanded smooth, sent to him in a brown envelope years after her departure. To be seen is not to be needed. To be needed is not to be known, but to be remembered. That is enough. Visitors often paused to read it, not always understanding, but they lingered and asked who had written it. No one ever answered, but the Duke, when he passed through, would rest his hand on the frame before continuing on in silence. On rare occasions, a carriage from Bath arrived in the summer, simple and unadorned. A woman stepped out, never announced, and walked the gardens at dusk. No one approached her. She never stayed past nightfall. Once Eliza, now head maid herself, watched from the upper window as Clara knelt beside the chapel hedges, planting something in the earth. Lavender. Always lavender. She did not visit the main house. She did not need to. Years passed. Children were born. The names of dukes changed, but something in the air at Highley remained. An expectation, a memory, a story never fully told, but always present. The girl who had served at the edge of the room now lingered in its very center, no longer as a figure but as a presence. Her story was not carved in stone nor embroidered in family trees. It existed in softer places, in the way someone now knocked before entering a maid's quarters, in the silence before a toast, in the way the young footman dared to look up when addressed. And still, no one dared mention her name again, but every room remembered her.